Morning, everyone. We're going to give it a few minutes to let people trickle into the Zoom room.
There's Alberto. So we do have 60 registered, so it might take a little bit to get everyone in.
All right, let's get things started. Hi, my name is Dr. Trace Kershaw. For those of you who do not know me, I am the director of CIRA. For those of you who don't know CIRA, we are the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on AIDS. We are a P30 ARC center, which is a center really with our focus is, and our mission is to support innovative and interdisciplinary research that focuses on the implementation of HIV prevention and treatment and the elimination of HIV disparities and its comorbidities. And several of you, I think, are relatively new to CIRA, and we just want to welcome you and let you know that we would welcome you to become more familiar and potentially become affiliated with the center. We have a lot to offer. We have services that range from potential availability of funding to peer review to methodologic support to dissemination and community outreach. So please, if you're interested, we'll give you some opportunities at the end to work with us in the future. So one of our fundamental focuses is to reduce HIV-related disparities, and one of the large drivers of that is stigma. And so we are very honored today to have our first panel, hopefully in a series, on the concept of intersectional stigma. And our moderator for that panel is Dr. John Pachankis, who is an expert in stigma and an associate professor at the Yale School of Public Health, and also the director of our Community Research and Implementation Core. So welcome, John. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Trace, and thanks for that nice overview of CIRA and what we're doing today. So, welcome everyone to this presentation and discussion on intersectional stigma in the context of HIV prevention and care. We hope that this can be an ongoing series of discussions about this important topic that can be shaped by your input during and after today's discussions. Today's presentation follows the recent public report by the National Institute of Mental Health and the Office of AIDS Research entitled HIV-Related Intersectional Stigma. This report was shaped with input across several working meetings led by NIMH and the Office of AIDS Research and attended by several of us at CIRA, including some of today's panelists. As discussed in those meetings, intersectional stigma has and will continue to shape NIMH's HIV-related funding priorities and a planned special issue in the American Journal of Public Health. Topics covered in that report were ways to measure intersectional stigma, advances in interventions that address intersectional stigma, and integrating and tailoring interventions to advance ending the epidemic and improve HIV prevention and care. Today's distinguished panelists will address all of these topics. They'll illustrate the relevance of intersectional stigma through their own deep research and community involvement on this topic. And as we'll learn, none of us possess only one identity. What makes us who we are is shaped by our race, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic position, employment status, abilities and disabilities, gender, sexual orientation, language status, immigrant status, family makeup, political beliefs, body shape, size, and image, and numerous other essential aspects of self. For many, one or some of these identities, they're stigmatized. They're put down, pushed away, or silenced in obvious ways and subtle ways, ways that compromise the right to health or even the right to just be ourselves. Today's panelists will talk about how that process works for individuals whose selves lie at the intersections of multiple stigmatized identities. And we at CIRA are grateful for the tireless work of these panelists through their research and community involvement to improve the life chances of those populations at multiple margins of oppression. And we're excited to learn from their collective wisdom today. So each speaker is going to present their work for 12 minutes, followed by about a 5 to 8 minute discussion. And if questions arise during the presentation, please send them to me using the chat feature, and I'll moderate the questions. Otherwise, we'll open up the conversation to the full audience for you to speak up as soon as each speaker is finished. So our first speaker is Dr. Skyler Jackson, an associate research scientist at the Yale School of Public Health. Dr. Jackson's a rising star in the area of intersectional stigma and was recently awarded one of NIMH's few KO1 Career Development Awards focused squarely on the topic of intersectional stigma and HIV, specifically among gay and bisexual men of color. He received his PhD from the University of Maryland in counseling psychology and was a CIRA postdoctoral fellow for 2 years. We're lucky that he stayed at Yale and at CIRA as he pursues his KO1 research and numerous other innovative studies like on border identity stress and dehumanization, which I'm sure we'll all be hearing about down the road. Today, Dr. Jackson will introduce us to the topic of intersectional stigma and some of his work on the topic. Thank you, Skyler.
All right, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to one of my favorite subjects and something that's dear to my heart and dear to my research, intersectional stigma. Thank you for that introduction of not only my work, but really putting intersectionality and intersectional stigma into context for those that are with us today. John, my task as I took it up is really out of acknowledgement of the fact that we're a diverse group with regard to roles. Also, I imagine diverse with regard to familiarity with intersectionality, that I wanted to begin by providing a bit of a landscape for intersectionality and intersectional stigma by talking not only about its roots, but also getting into where we are now and some of the that maybe get in the way of advancement in intersectional stigma as it is being used to advance HIV research and care, and also think about some of the future directions that are on the horizon. So with that said, I'll go ahead and jump in. And I want to start by how we have come as a group of people studying health or being providers, really be thinking about intersectionality as we're talking about the health of marginalized populations. And to talk about that, we have to recognize that we are in the midst of a much larger shift in how we think about health disparities and why minority populations might face poorer health, and how we learn about those unique vulnerabilities, right? So in the last 50 years, we used to think about identities in isolation. You might either as a clinician or as a researcher gain competencies in the gay patient or the Black patient or some other social demographic. And that did not account for the fact that people actually face multiple forms of marginalization at the same time. Now, of course, since then we have progressed, begun to acknowledge and embrace the fact that identities are multiple and additive. There are models now, such as the addressing model, which reminds us of the many sorts of differences that make a difference in society and for health. And we've begun to understand that these identities can have an additive or compounding impact on outcomes such as HIV. But beyond that, now people are starting to think much more frequently about the complexities of the ways that our multiple identifications collide, conflict, come together to create unique experiences, risks, and outcomes for a variety of people that are navigating a number of different systems simultaneously. And the theory that has helped us to grapple with this the most is that of intersectionality. Intersectionality has its roots in Black feminist activism, legal studies, and critical race theory, and it really aims to give us the tools to understand how people's unique experiences, risks, and resiliencies arise from and are impacted by multiple systems of power. In short, that people's experiences are greater than the sum of their parts. And that if we truly believe that, if we truly believe that people's experiences are greater than the sum of their parts, then when we want to understand how those experiences lead to different health outcomes, it's best that we think about those experiences, these various aspects of oppression, in an integrated manner simultaneously. Right? And we're seeing a growing presence of intersectionality and work on intersectional stigma in the social sciences and health research more broadly. Now, if you've heard me talk about intersectional stigma, I know some people in here have been to some of my talks in the past. I spend some time talking about some of the conflicts and controversies in the field about what is and what isn't intersectionality. And I'm not going to be talking about today. What instead I want to focus on is the things that, for the most part, that most people that are adopting an intersectional approach hold true and agree upon. And so a few things. One is this notion that all people are simultaneously characterized by multiple social categories, and that these things are interconnected and co-constructed. Second is that it's not just that we have categories, that these categories confer privileges and advantages and disadvantages and oppression to others. So there's an aspect of equity or inequality of power that is laid across and around these dimensions of experience. And finally, there's intersectional theorists and researchers tend to think that these categories, these social identities are not static, but they mean different things across time and across situations, such that at one point, one person's gender or class might be salient, but as they move throughout their day or move across different spaces, move across their life, that different aspects of who they are become salient, and that there's a fluid dynamic nature to issues of identity and oppression. Now, if we're going to think about how intersectionality influences people's experiences broadly, we can also assume that if it constrains or co-constructs experience, it also has the ability to co-construct HIV risk, how HIV stigma operates. And so that's been an increasing use of intersectionality, particularly because when we think about HIV, so many of the highest risk populations are those who face multiple forms of marginalization. So it's sort of a natural fit to bring intersectionality as a broader framework into the study of HIV treatment, prevention, and care. But there is still some work to do right now as intersectionality a rapid movement into the social sciences and in particular research on HIV is that with anything that becomes popular quickly, it is vulnerable to misuse and misunderstanding. And sometimes those misunderstandings can get in the way of advancement of HIV research and care. So I want to talk about some myths quickly. I'm going to review 4 of them briefly in the time that I have. First, I want to discuss is the notion that intersectionality is a framework developed to understand health disparities. That may seem like it is, right? That's how we think about it. That's how many of us use it. But the truth is that many argue that intersectionality as a theory, as a framework, is actually somewhat incongruent with contemporary Western academic research methods. And in fact, we can go further that although intersectionality was articulated by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw within academia, that is not where intersectionality starts, and that's not the only place where intersectionality lives. Right? In fact, intersectionality was created by and for Black feminists to articulate their often obscured experiences, their unique standpoints, and the ways in which multiple systems of oppression. And so even well before Dr. Crenshaw so eloquently articulated this concept within the academic world, it was already being spoken about by Black feminist organizations and a number of different Black women scholars, activists, artists, etc. And in fact, intersectionality has an even longer history, right? We can see, and here I put up a quote, the first recorded articulations of intersectional thinking by Sojourner Truth in 1851 as a part of her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech. You can see the core components of her as she begins to articulate through this excerpt of this larger speech, how her experience as a woman, right? She says, that man over there says women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? So what she did throughout this speech and in this point is articulate that multiple aspects of her identity, in this case, her race, actually changed the way she experienced being a woman she was afforded. And we can see even through to today, intersectionality is a core component of how many social activists and political movements are thinking about the world around them, even in the current movement for Black lives, as we've been discussing it more and more in the aftermath of the killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, that was shot multiple times, regulations of intersectional thinking. So this is a reminder to recall that although intersectionality as a framework has much promise and use within the social sciences and for HIV research, it isn't where it was born, and there are some challenges as we figure out how to fit it into the world to answer the questions we want to answer. Myth number 2, intersectionality argues that individuals with more oppressed identities fare worse, and often a way that we boil down what we think intersectionality is about, which is to say just that the more stigma you have, the more strife you have, and the more health problems you have. When in truth, intersectionality doesn't say that explicitly. Instead, it suggests that it's more complicated, that we need to think about various aspects of oppression and identity simultaneously to understand the outcome it is, even if that outcome is that people who have multiple aspects of oppression in their lives may have learned resilience from one aspect of their identity and oppression and can then apply it and have better outcomes when facing another aspect of oppression. So I just want to erode this myth that, that intersectionality is just saying multiple oppressions means full health. One helpful metaphor that's come up is that's been shared by Dr. Lisa Boleg, who not only has talked about that intersectionality is more of a framework for analyzing the world than a theory that tells you how specific relationships are associated, but also has talked about it as cake, right? So cake, just like identities, it's greater than the sum of its parts, right? Once we bake the cake, as she has so eloquently put, we cannot then taste or extract out the parts that we used to make the cake, right? Number 3, intersectionality helps health researchers assess how multiple identities impact HIV risk. On the surface, this may seem true, but there's an increasing focus on not just thinking about identities, but really being aware of the fact that we're talking about multiple forms of oppression, right? So it's not our identities that are the problem, but our identities put us at risk for forms of oppression. And that is the focus of intersectional theory. There's been an increasing focus in intersectional on structural level stigma in health. And for many people, they say that the gold star way to do intersectionality research in the health sciences is to really think about how macro level factors, such as laws and policies, impact micro level experiences, such as our sexual risk. But in short, even if that's not achieved, one sort of quick heuristic to remember is that it's not less about identity and more about the social processes that happen as a result of those identities. So there's a great quote on this using another metaphor by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who uses the literal metaphor of an intersection and says, consider an analogy to traffic in an intersection, coming and going in all four directions. Discrimination, like traffic through an intersection, may flow in one direction and it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions and sometimes from all of them. And she's used to discuss how what this means is that Black women can face regular old racism sometimes, regular old patriarchy and misogyny sometimes, but other times, other things that are really about a complex combination of factors. And that it is this that we need to be thinking about, not just that people have identities, but what happens in the intersections is what causes the harm. All right, last but not least, I would say that few people articulate this belief or this myth, but we see the residue of it in research. And that is this notion that single identity analyses are focusing on one aspect of stigma should precede and inform intersectional approaches to stigma. So we start with one and then maybe we add in two, right? And then we have two and then maybe we add in three. This incremental approach is really favored and kind of inherently favored by and think about science. The problem for intersectionality is that working in that way often reverts to an additive way of thinking about stigma. And often it means that the most marginalized groups get the research, get the interventions, get the measures last, which is sort of incongruent with social justice. And so I often ask myself and the researchers I work with and my research assistants, what kind of measures, interventions, and findings would we produce if we thought about the multiply marginalized communities from the start? And one recent paper, Turin et al. Has talked about how funders also have an incentive to be thinking about multiple marginalized identities at the same time. So last but not least, I just want to share you with one slide about future directions. As John mentioned earlier, some of us, and I'm one of those people that was a part of the 2020 working groups on intersectional stigma and HIV. And so I just wanted to lay out and share a little bit of where at least one metric or one component of the scientific community, where NIH and where they're really thinking about intersectional stigma. And so these were the 4 topics of the working group. And so what you see here is there's a real focus on measurement. How do we begin to measure what intersectionality is in a way that can help us generate new knowledge and intervene upon health disparities? Working group 2 focused on opportunities, how we monitor intersectional stigma and discrimination. Working group 3 was looking at the evidence base for intersectional stigma interventions. And working group 4, which was the one I was a part of, was thinking about what are the ways we can integrate and tailor intersectional interventions as it corresponds with the ending the epidemic work and to improve HIV prevention and treatment outcomes, right? And so this presentation of the results of these working groups is now online on NIH's website. So if you're interested more about some of the conclusions that experts drew in these various working groups, that information is available. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation today. I didn't focus as much on my work to measure or intervene upon intersectional stigma with gay and bisexual men of color, but instead wanted to lay the groundwork so that we're all on the same page when we're thinking about what intersection is, where we often get stuck, and where we might go next. So with that, I'll end and bring John, you back in to take us to some questions.
Great. Well, thank you for that excellent introduction, Skyler. And we got some comments in the chat saying that debunking the myths of intersectionality has been extremely helpful. So that sentiment shared across the audience. We also have a few questions. One is, let's see. So one of the audience members asks that there's a use of categories, like identity-related categories, and that when we use those categories, we might unduly, quote unquote, blame the victim. So from a structural perspective, it's racism versus race. So thinking about like Lincoln Phelan's work versus Kaufman's work. Can you speak a little to that, the use of race and racism, race versus racism in scholarship, and how that might be related to addressing intersectionality?
Definitely. It's a really interesting point, and many scholars are in the midst of struggling with and sorting out for themselves. If I can try to articulate what I think the part of the question is and in some ways it relates to one of the myths that I raised, is that what we're here to do is to think about how intersecting identities lead to different health disparities. What I want to start with is saying that is incredibly important. We need to continue to understand the differences in the prevalence of different health outcomes across different groups, including multiply marginalized populations versus singly marginalized populations. Those comparisons are really helpful. What intersectional scholars and experts continue to argue is that if we really want to live up to standards of what intersectional theorists say is going on in the world, we have to move beyond just talking about demographic categories and start talking about what is impacting these demographic categories to actually drive disparity. And so, yes, so this, I think the example that was given there is not just thinking about race and what are the differences between racial groups when it comes to, HIV testing or treatment or mortality rates, but thinking specifically about the structural and individual level factors that shape what it means to be a Black American, what it means to endure white supremacy in one's everyday life, what these sorts of cultural social processes that surround one's life, how those things are actually what's driving what we might think we see when we just run comparisons between groups. And so, but it is a challenge, because as I didn't go into depth with, but alluded to, measuring these social processes of intersectional stigma is incredibly difficult. Trying to quantify what intersectional stigma is continues to elude many of the most seasoned researchers. And so it is for that reason that we see so many findings in this area that focus on identities as opposed to stigma. And why you saw that last slide, working group number 1 was to focus on thinking about measures and how we can harmonize measures to really move us forward.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Tiffany, for raising that question. Again, to the audience, feel free to continue sharing your questions on the chat. They come to me and some of the other hosts, and we'll be sure to share them with the panelists. Skyler, there's another question about community involvement and doing community engaged research from an intersectional lens. And I know that you've been active in some community initiatives to develop intersectional intervention and deliver those interventions with members of the community. So we'd love to hear how intersectionality influences your approach to that community-based work.
Definitely. I think I'm by no means an expert in all of the ways or best practices that people are using to do intersectional work in a way that really honors and brings in the community or works with community partners. But I have certainly, and I think I'll just share a few of the things that come to mind first, which is that just like in all research in which we're working with marginalized populations or across where there's a lot of social distance possibly between the researcher and the community, thinking carefully and intentionally about power dynamics and often tends to be even more important because oftentimes the distance can be greater when you're working with some of the multiply marginalized populations. So thinking about ways to not only integrate community perspectives into the work, but also to value the real knowledge that they have is a big challenge about in the working group that I was in when working on this, on intersectionality within NIMH. We talked a lot about the ways in which many of us strive to have community voices and a balance of power, but how, because of the ways that the skills that we have are differentially valued in the research process, that doesn't always pan out the way that we expect. And the big challenges that we have ahead in working to really value and integrate community voices. One other thought that comes to mind about working with community partners is, and this is more thinking about working with maybe organizations as a researcher, thinking about an intervention and working with community partners where I've seen either with myself or with colleagues it play out in a way that's positive or negative. And that is that a lot of times the agenda of the researchers doesn't directly overlap with the community in which you're trying to serve or the community partner. And our inability to really acknowledge and work through those differences in what we want, what we need, how research needs to happen for us doesn't always fit with what the outcomes that the provider wants to see or the community wants to see or the community itself is invested in, is a really important conversation to have from the beginning. So what you'll hear in what I'm saying is, at least so far, I'm not saying things that are vastly different from the typical hurdles that we see in working with stigmatized populations, except for that these conversations sometimes become even more important because these communities are often researched. They experience kind of, helicopter in researchers who come in and do the research and then leave. There's a lot of mistrust of researchers. And so these sorts of early conversations are all the more important.
Great. Thank you, Skyler. Well, we have many more excellent questions on the chat. As far as process goes, we're going to open up, after the next two presenters go, we're going to open the conversation up to dialogue across the presenters. So there'll be more time for these great questions that are coming in, but I'm noting them all, and we'll get back to revisiting them as soon as our next two presenters go. So thank you, Skyler, for that wonderful introduction. And I will introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jasmine Abrams, who's an international behavioral research scientist and assistant professor of community health sciences at the Boston University School of Public Health. So recognizing that interdisciplinary approaches are needed to address health disparities, she utilizes intersectionality theory and biopsychosocial approaches to investigate the etiology and prevention of disparities experienced by Black women across the African diaspora. Dr. Abrams has secured numerous awards to support her work in programming, including from several NIH institutes and the Office of Women's Health. Dr. Abrams is also an entrepreneur and founder of the Thrive Institute for Professional Development that offers transformative training experiences for early career academics focused on increasing their productivity and well-being. So thank you, Dr. Abrams, for joining us today. We're looking forward to learning about your work on intersectional stigma.
Thank you so much for that introduction, John. Hi, everyone. Super excited to be with you all today to share about some work that I'm super passionate about. I love talking about intersectionality, and HIV prevention research has been a passion of mine for a long while now. So I'm going to begin my talk with you all about stigma itself. And I want to start with a story. So a few years ago, I was giving a lecture in a graduate level health psychology course. And to introduce them to the concept of stigma, I asked them to take out a sheet of paper and write down the words, "I have HIV" on it. And then I asked everyone if they would go ahead and pick up their papers. And I told them we were gonna go outside and stand on one of the busy areas of campus and just hold up our signs together. Naturally, I got a range of responses, from horrified to shocked to downright offended, like, "Excuse me, you want me to do what?" And I even got several verbal, no, absolutely not. I'm not going to do that. And so I use this as the teachable moment by asking them, why? Why is it that you don't want people to see you holding that sign? Why is it that you don't want people to know or to think that you have HIV? And I asked them to respond. A few of them shared because people are going to think bad things about me, or people are going to think untrue things about me. People are going to make negative assumptions about me. People might treat me differently. People might be mean to me or harm me. And I shared with them that this is the very power of stigma, right? It conveys devalued stereotypes, it's discrediting, it's dividing, and it has the power to ultimately shape how others interact with us, how we interact with others, and how we interact with and perceive ourselves. So looking at just a basic definition of stigma, Goffman, who's been mentioned by John a few times, was a pioneering stigma researcher, and he classically defines stigma as an attribute that's deeply discrediting. But I really like this definition of health stigma, which takes that a little bit further. And it says it's a social process or related personal experience characterized by exclusion, rejection, blame, or devaluation that results from experience or reasonable anticipation of an adverse social judgment about a person or a group identified with a particular health problem. And Goffman, again, one of these pioneering researchers who's somewhere up there with John Pachankis, identified three primary categorizations of stigma processes. The first, Goffman called abominations of the body, more appropriately called physical health ailments. So these would be things like HIV, mental health issues, cancer, infertility, et cetera. The second was what Goffman called tribal forms of stigma, and what others are calling affiliation with marginalized groups. So think about racial or ethnic identity, gender identity, sexual orientation. And the third are factors attributed to one's moral character or behaviors. What Goffman called blemishes of individual character. These are things like smoking, alcohol use, substance use, sex work, which we'll hear a little bit more about in a later presentation, gender-based violence, and poverty. And when we start attempting to understand that if you occupy more than one stigmatized identity, then intersectionality becomes incredibly relevant. So the rootedness of stigma in larger systems of inequality and webs of power have pushed researchers to consider the different ways that stigma interacts with these factors and to ultimately analyze it. So given stigma's links to historical and contemporary manifestations of inequality, power, systems of domination, again, intersectionality serves as a very useful complement to stigma research and offers a promising theoretical approach to examine research on stigma. And like Skyler mentioned, Black feminists who coined and produced the theory on the concept of intersectionality, they highlighted how multiple oppression and structural inequalities exist and ultimately reinforce unequal relationships of power amongst people and between people in the social institutions that they interact with, such as healthcare, such as housing, such as the law. And intersectionality, again, as Skyler so eloquently highlighted, was originally conceptualized within feminist theory to describe Black women's positions within these webs of power. So it's more recently been taken up by the health sciences to help deepen our analyses of structural and systemic issues in health and to also examine individuals' experiences. But I want to take a second before we move forward in talking about intersectional stigma by just talking about this problem that we've seen emerging in the research. So intersectionality is definitely not rocket science, but it's certainly a rigorous framework, and its complexity and rigor is sometimes lost by what Rosenthal describes as the flattening of intersectionality. which essentially is an overemphasis on research that seeks to understand the experiences of individuals with multiple marginalized identities, rather than conceptualizing and framing the social inequities that shape those experiences, and identifying solutions that address the source of the inequity. So again, this was talked about in Skyler's presentation, and we're gonna take it a step further by marrying it with stigma. So intersectional stigma is a concept that's emerged in the literature to characterize the convergence of multiple stigmatized identities within a person or a group, and to address their effects. So intersectionality scholars have been very critical of those additive approaches to understanding experiences associated with identity. And more recent critiques of this approach has highlighted how we need to do a better job of focusing on the interconnectedness of the identities and how the interconnectedness creates these unique experiences of marginalization and stigmatization. In other words, the additive approach is counter to the conceptualization of intersectional stigma because discrete categories of identities such as race alone or gender alone or sexual orientation alone fail to account for the singular multidimensional lived experiences of individuals, right? So with this conceptualization, an intersectional perspective helps researchers and health professionals and advocates to think more holistically about how living with multiple stigmatized identities can impact health behavior and population level health outcomes. And one framework that does a really excellent job of tying this all together is the health and stigma discrimination framework. It essentially articulates the stigmatization process as it unfolds across the socio-ecological spectrum in the context of health. So it breaks down the process into a series of domains, including the drivers and facilitators of stigma, stigma marking and manifestations, and how ultimately these things interact to influence a wide range of outcomes among affected populations, as well as the organizations and institutions that ultimately impact health and society. So here, you'll notice that the stigma markings piece are in line with Goffman's categories of stigma that I mentioned earlier. However, in this particular framework, they've added this notion of intersecting stigmas. So it's that concept of this idea of having these converging multiple stigmatized identities again. And pulling from the HIV research literature, I felt like this particular article gave a really great example of what that looks like in practice in terms of research. And Logie and colleagues really narrowed in on intersectional stigma to propose this model based on their work with HIV positive women, where their participants essentially described interdependent and mutually constitutive relationships between marginalized social identities and inequities such as HIV-related stigma, sexism, racism, homophobia, and transphobia. So these overlapping and multi-level forms of stigma and discrimination are representative of an intersectional model of stigma and discrimination that you see here on the left. And the participants weren't just describing how experiencing sex work stigma and gender stigma and race stigma influenced some of their behaviors, but they really capitalized on describing how it was all of those things tied together that created a unique experience of stigma for them. So again, occupying all of these different stigmatized identities was different than just experiencing HIV-related stigma or stigma that a Black woman living with HIV might experience, or stigma that a trans Black woman living with HIV experienced if you were a person that did sex works and occupied all of those identities. And to help us conceptualize how this ultimately impacts health, I feel like this is a really great model that captures that. So there's a ton of research. I'll let you guys look at the model and just explain how some of this looks in the research literature. here are just a few examples. So coexisting discrimination among African-American adults living with HIV has been associated with decreased HIV disclosure and worse medication adherence. In addition, more severe symptoms of depression have been seen among HIV positive men who reported increased stigma associated with having sex with men who have sex with men in particular. HIV positive women and racial minorities have also reported increased stigma related to HIV and racial stigma. And then persons living with comorbid HIV and tuberculosis infection, so having two health-related stigmas, have also reported more severe symptoms of depression. In addition, studies of transgender women living with HIV have indicated lower access to HIV-related healthcare relative to cisgendered people. And they attributed this primarily due to the pervasive experiences with transphobia, and for those who are of a racial or ethnic minority group, the combination of that as well. And related to a point that Skyler made in his second myth about how multiple oppression means that people fare worse, we actually see that there can be some positive impacts for folks who experience multiple forms of stigma. So I definitely want to say that this is a little piece of evidence that supports that myth that Skyler presented. So one positive impact that we see is that people who identify with multiple stigmatized identities might actually, or tend to actually find solidarity within communities of others who occupy those same identities. And that tends to offer protection against some of stigma's negative effects. So for example, among Black women with HIV, this is a study that was done in Chicago, awareness of some of the systemic oppression that they experience actually helped to prompt a desire within them to join others to enact social change or this critical social consciousness. And that was ultimately associated with the higher likelihood of them having a greater, a lower likelihood of detectable HIV viral load when they had greater experiences of racial discrimination. So as I close, I want to end with this quote by Kimberly Crenshaw that says, intersectionality has been the banner under which many demands for inclusion have been made, but a term can do no more than those who use it have the power to demand. So I think about this for the participants in my research, but also for us as scholars in the field. And I think taking this into consideration, it falls on our shoulders to utilize these critical theories to advance science and methodology. And Skyler gave us some really great considerations for things we may want to be thinking about related to advancing theory and quantitative research. And I just want to take that a step further by adding some ways that we might want to consider these things in qualitative health research, which is an area that most of my work has been focused in. So I don't have time to go into the details of this paper, but I just want to highlight that it's out there in case you want to access it and let you all know that its intended use is as a guide for researchers who are interested in applying intersectionality in the qualitative health research space. So this could be thinking about your research questions or recruiting participants to actually collecting and analyzing your data. And I feel like this could be very useful for folks interested in intersectional stigma, as well as health equity a bit broadly. So with that, I will close my presentation. I thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you, Dr. Abrams, for an excellent talk. And thanks for sharing that last paper on qualitative methods and intersectionality. I know it's been making the rounds at CIRA and beyond. So thanks for sharing that excellent scholarship. We have a bunch of questions. Given your work with women across the African diaspora, I know you have you have an NIH award to do work in Haiti as well. This one question from the audience seems particularly suitable. So HIV rates vary geographically across the US and elsewhere. for example, like in the southern U.S., the southern U.S. accounts for a large proportion of incidence and prevalence of HIV. So how do you think intersectional stigma varies geographically, and how's that related to geographical differences? And how can that inform intervention tailoring?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. There are definitely stigmas associated with being from different parts of this country. And I think we can definitely see that in these times, considering the recent election and those kinds of things. And geographically also beyond the United States, I think we also see that there's different stigmas associated with being from certain countries, particularly when you have a higher income country bordering a lower income or middle income country. We definitely see various types and forms of stigma emerge. In the context of HIV prevention, I definitely think this is something that needs to be attended to, but is often not attended to. This sort of idea of thinking about geographically tailoring interventions. I definitely think it's something worth considering, given that experiences of discrimination differ depending on where you are in this country, and depending on who you are, where you are. I love some of the work by Dr. Bridget Bronner, who's also affiliated with CIRA, that talks about sort of this idea of geo-behavioral risk in HIV. And I think that's a really nice complement because it adds in that missing component from HIV prevention that we often tend to neglect, and allows us to really capitalize on being able to weave in the importance of, it's not just who you are and what you're doing, but it's who you are, what you're doing, and where you're doing it that ultimately has an impact on your health.
Excellent, thank you. Another audience member says, Dr. Abrams, thank you. Can you speak some to the role of self-perception in shaping one's experiences with the multiple dimensions of stigma, like enacted, internalized, anticipated? Is perception the same or different from internalization?
Yeah, that's also a really important question. There's definitely a difference between perception and internalization. I think perception is more of the cognitive experience of it, but then internalization is actually where you begin to see the impacts on behavior take place. So with the internalization aspect, I think that's really related to this sort of idea of anticipated stigma, and then some of the behaviors that individuals engage in related to internalizing some of the impacts of stigma. So perceiving that someone is stigmatizing against you is pretty easy, but then believing whatever your perceived thoughts about what this person sees on you is a whole additional thing. And we see in the research literature that that's really what's ultimately connected to how people engage with HIV prevention and care. So thinking about things like disclosing a status, or being tested regularly, or using condoms in a context where maybe condom negotiation might be a little bit challenging, even taking medication, accessing those things on a regular basis. So yeah, I would definitely think, based on some of the work that I've reviewed, that internalization would be a little bit more impactful to some of the HIV-related behaviors.
Great, thank you. Well, again, to the audience, feel free to keep the questions coming, and we'll engage in a larger discussion with all the panelists in dialogue with each other at the end of the last presentation. Thank you, Dr. Abrams, for sharing your excellent thoughts on intersectionality. We really appreciate it and look forward to the Q&A at the end. So our next panelist is Alberto Cifuentes. For over a decade, Alberto's been a community organizer and social justice advocate for underrepresented and marginalized populations, including LGBTQ+ individuals, undocumented immigrants, and returning citizens. He's been an active leader of several nonprofits, such as the National Association of Social Workers in the Connecticut chapter and GLSEN, Connecticut. Alberto is a health policy research scholar, a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Fellowship supporting doctoral students whose research and leadership advances policy toward a culture of health. Alberto's research focuses on developing inclusive and equitable policies and practices for consensual sex workers, those that willingly participate in the sex trade. His dissertation that he's currently working on will explore the effects of stigma and criminalization on the health outcomes of consensual sex workers using a sex-positive harm reduction approach. His ultimate goal is to direct an organization that will increase access to vital services and programs for consensual sex workers. So thank you, Alberto, for joining us today, and we're enthusiastically looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Dr. Pachankis. Thank you so much, Dr. Abrams and Dr. Jackson, for your great presentations. I really think you laid out the foundation for intersectional stigma. I don't need to go too much into that, which I didn't. I'm going to explain how I view it, but I'm really going to go more into the application of it and into the argument that I'm making about what we can do to strengthen public health services for sex workers. So I'm a doctoral candidate and graduate assistant at the UConn School of Social Work. This research is born out of my own community organizing. I'm a macro practitioner. I'm a community organizer, policy advocate. I also do some social service administration, and most of my experience has been organizing the LGBTQ community for social change, for rights, for equality. And a segment of that population that I noticed was being ignored were sex workers. Sex workers were invisible from a lot of queer spaces. They were shut out of a lot of queer spaces, or they just didn't feel welcome. And so this was my attempt to really look at this population and see what we could do to make it better for them, not just health-wise, but also policy-wise. So I start off with, I love this quote. This was at a protest against ill treatment of sex workers. No bad whores, only bad laws. So in a lot of spaces, in a lot of sex worker spaces, sex workers have reclaimed that term whores as something that's positive. So that's a reclaiming of that term. But it's pointing out that there really aren't any bad sex workers, that sex workers inherently, they aren't a diseased population. But that's a myth that's propagated by a lot of stigma, that sex workers are a diseased population. And so they're saying that there really aren't any bad workers or bad sex workers. They're really just bad laws and bad policies. Those are what keep sex workers at risk for illness and for negative health outcomes. So that's why I started off with that, because I think that gives a really good foundation to the argument that I'm trying to make. So the way I understand intersectionality is a lot like how I think Dr. Jackson and Dr. Abrams understand it. It's a framework for helping us understand the multiple identities that we embody as individuals, as well as our shifting levels of power and privilege, that this can be very fluid. And that it's also a lens for reflecting on how our own multiple identities impact our lived experiences as we move through the world on an individual, familial, institutional, systemic level. So I love the way that Laverne Cox, you probably know, she's an actress and she says, just me existing as an openly Black transgender woman from working class background thriving is a political act. So she outlines all her different identities, and I'm sure those aren't the only identities that she has. That she's Black, she's transgender, she's from a working class background. But even that is a political act, because she's been taught by her own culture, by her own society, that she should fail. That's the narrative that's propagated by stigma, that Black transgender women from working class backgrounds, just Black trans women in general, should fail. And she's saying even that is a political act of resistance. It's a political act of rebellion. So you probably know her from Orange is the New Black, but she's spoken a lot on the role of Black trans women in our society and how stigma impacts Black trans women. And you've heard a lot about stigma, about the definitions of stigma. I often interpret stigma as shame. That's the way I manifested it myself. As a community member, shame is the way I manifested stigma. And Brene Brown, who's also a social worker, says that it's the extremely painful belief or experience of being unlovable or unworthy of connection or belonging. And I love what Lola Davina, she's a sex workers' rights activist and a former sex worker, she says, I would add, as a sex worker, I would add that it also means unworthy of protection, dignity, and humanity. So that's the extent of the impact of stigma on many sex workers. That's not just about not being loved by your immediate social supports, by your family or your friends. It's also about feeling unworthy of protection by the state, feeling unworthy of protection by law enforcement, and feeling that your dignity and humanity are completely stripped because you're perceived as less than. And intersectional is just one of the forms of stigma that I've looked at. And I've looked at internalized stigma. I call it the 4 I's of kind of identity-based stigma. So internalized, which is more individualized, interpersonal, which is more social relational, institutional, which is structural systemic, like policies, and then intersectional, which is what we've talked about, the interrelationship of multiple oppressions. So that's what I talked about. You probably heard about perceived stigma and enacted stigma. I think those are all different forms of stigma, but I really like kind of just mnemonically, I like outlining it. These are the different I's. These are the different types of identity-based stigmas that a lot of marginalized communities face. And I really want to emphasize that sex workers are a really heterogeneous population, that we tend to think of them as prostitutes, as full-service sex workers, but not all of them are full-service sex workers. Especially during COVID-19, a lot of sex workers had to migrate to mainly online spaces, internet-based spaces. So they can be exotic dancers, they can be webcam models, they can be phone sex operators, pornographic actresses or actors. And the really great thing to note, and I use the sex work is work umbrella. So the umbrella, it's literally an umbrella term, but it's also a metaphor. The red umbrella is it's a symbol of protection and safety for sex workers and emancipation from the barriers that a lot of sex workers have had to face because of bad policies, bad laws, and stigmatizing people who stigmatize, communities that stigmatize. And I talk about sex work as consensual work between adults, between consenting adults. There are different ways to talk about it. One common way is the spectrum of choice, circumstances, and coercion. I tend to talk about it in terms of the sex workers that I'm looking at in my research. I look at consent based on consent, and not always based on safety, unfortunately, but based on consent and based on people 18 and over. And the graphic on your left outlines what the kind of the stigma that sex workers often have to experience by law enforcement. And this narrative that this law enforcement is saying, I'm here to save you for your suffering. So I'm cuffing you, I'm arresting you because you are a prostitute. And, you know, and he's saying, and that sex worker is asking, are you gonna pay my rent? Like I'm doing this to survive. And he's saying, no, I'm gonna put these handcuffs on you and that's gonna save you. So it's this carceral system, which is completely antithetical to what I think a lot of people would be, in terms of social workers, would be promoting, which is more restorative justice, kind of transformative justice model. This is totally a carceral model. And this is all, and these carceral models are based on stigmas against sex workers, against, well, if you arrest them, that will immediately protect. We don't have to protect them, we have to protect people from them. And so I have seen the effects of criminalization on sex workers, on this push to incarcerate them rather than to rehabilitate. Some have substance use issues, some are at risk for HIV. Not addressing these, but just incarcerating them is not the solution. So I've recommended decriminalization, which is to take the criminal penalties away from both sex workers and their clients, as long as they're engaging in safe, sane, consensual work between adults. Decriminalization acknowledges that police violence against sex workers and holds law enforcement accountable for abuses of power. Again, unfortunately, through this carceral system, there are a lot of abuses by law enforcement. We see it against people of color as well. Because of this carceral system, And due to the systemic racism within this carceral system, there's a lot of persecution of a lot of Black and brown people by law enforcement. The decriminalization is a harm reduction right-based approach that I believe will really close the health gap because it centers the voices of sex workers. It involves them. So I'm part of the community advisory board for CIRA. And I think one of the primary purposes of our group is to get those impacted by HIV directly or indirectly to actually have a voice. And we need to do that in order to actually create effective programs and effective policies. It's not just going to take researchers. It's also going to take people who are involved, people who are engaged in this kind of work to provide a more equitable system. Harm reduction services are a myriad of services. They involve houses and shelters, substance use services, STI screenings, implementation of PrEP. As you probably know from the research, PrEP has been more effective and impactful in communities that are not of color. Why are communities of color missing access to PrEP? And we can attribute it to a lot of factors. Maybe we can attribute it to racism. Maybe we can attribute it to research priorities. But why aren't, if people of color aren't receiving these, sex workers are barely receiving these too, as being a very marginalized population. And my work is more in the prevention field rather than the care and treatment field, even though I believe that's really important. And I also believe that prevention has not been, it's one of the least examined. There's been a lot more research and funding for treatment and care, which again is important, but there just isn't enough for prevention, for education, for strategies, and occupational health safety tactics to promote prevention. And again, as Dr. Abrams and Dr. Jackson were saying, we need to center this on equity. We need to center this on really making sure that we are operating within these equitable systems, within our research, and also for the populations that we're trying to help. That we're not only creating custom tools that identify and address inequality, but actually trying to repair that system and offering equal access to those tools and opportunities. And my own recommendations, particularly for sex workers, are to increase access to social services and programs that a lot of sex workers don't have access to healthcare. So we need to increase that access. We need to involve them directly in the political process. I consider myself a political social worker. I am really for not only making sure that people have access to vote, but people have access to information about political candidates, and they can actually serve in politics and in their governments. And in some cities like New York City, Chicago, there are sex workers that are doing just that. I also think we need to work for reducing tensions between law enforcement and sex workers. Again, because of our carceral system, there's a lot of injustice. There's a lot of persecution of sex workers by law enforcement. So what kind of policies can we build to increase that trust and respect? There are a lot of policies that we need to get rid of. I don't have time to get into FOSTA SESTA, which is a harmful online anti-sex trafficking policy, but we need to create more policies that actually help create safe online platforms for engaging in consensual sex work. We know that street-based sex work is riskier, and unfortunately, policies that like FOSTA and SESTA that have shut down a lot of online forums, that those have actually minimized those forums, and therefore it's driven sex work further underground. And to advocate, again, for a decriminalization model, rather than other, like the Nordic and equality model, which is trying to be proposed by a lot of celebrities like Ashley Judd, and trying to say we criminalize the client, then we'll increase health outcomes. And if you look at how that's done in other countries like France and Canada, it's anything but. It actually does increase negative health outcomes for a lot of sex workers and negative treatment towards sex workers. And lastly, I just want to end. India Moore, she wore this really moving necklace of 17, 18 trans women that had been impacted by violent crimes because they're Black and trans and female. And she said that existence that requires bravery is not freedom. A life that requires bravery is not free. So I think we really need, if we're going to advocate through our research, we need to think about what we can do so that people can thrive, not just survive. because I think that's what India Moore's speaking about. We need to show that sex workers can thrive and not just survive. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation illustrating your advocacy and research on this often overlooked population that experiences intersectional inequities. A question that's come up from the audience is, how do the intersectional identities of the researcher impact the study of intersectional stigma? Or I guess thought about through another comment, like how do your intersectional identities shape the research and advocacy that you do?
So I think positionality is really important. So your positionality is, what is your relationship with the research at hand? And as someone who's had, I've had very visible stigmas, like the stigma of not having traditional gender expression, of being more feminine. I talk a lot with my hands. I've gotten a lot of criticism. I was bullied a lot for it in school. So that's very visible stigma. But then there's also invisible stigma. So that stigma that I don't usually share, that's more concealable. And that's my own struggles with mental health, my own struggles with depression. And that's something that I felt a lot of shame about, that I felt like, oh, if I have to take medication or if I have to seek a therapist, I'm a weak person. And as a social worker, you wouldn't really think like, how does he have that kind of ideology? It's totally antithetical as a social worker. But a lot of it I can trace back to how I was raised. I was raised in a really traditional Latin, like Colombian household, where to ask for help from anyone was seen as weakness. And my mom wanted me to be a lot like my dad, who's really strong, the strong silent type, doesn't really talk. I've never seen him cry at all. So that really informed me that visible and concealable, there's a lot of literature on visible and concealable stigma, which I encourage you to look at. But looking at that visible and invisible stigma and kind of looking at it in my own life, and how certain populations like sex workers, sometimes they try to keep it under wraps. Sometimes they don't even identify as sex workers. They just identify as people that do this occasionally, periodically. And then others are very much entrenched in the identity. I've seen this amongst some Black trans women that I've seen them talk at events. I've seen them protest. I've seen them rally for their rights, for being better treated by law enforcement, for not just being arrested. There are examples. I use them as role models and as examples of like how I can be brave about my own. I can be brave about my own self-stigmatization. So I self-stigmatize myself a lot. So I can be brave about that and use it as a rallying cry and use it as a show of solidarity.
Well, thank you for sharing that that personal motivation with us. Actually, one of the audience members asks, these are really big problems that seem almost insurmountable to overcome, especially nowadays. How do you really think these changes are possible? How do you keep yourself motivated going in the face of these huge problems?
These are like what we call wicked problems. Yeah. I keep myself motivated because of the work that's already being done by a lot of sex workers already, by their advocates, by the organizations like the Sex Workers Outreach Project. We have one local one in New Haven called SWAN, Sex Workers and Allies Network. They motivate me, they keep me, I use them as like my, other than the research that I do, like they're my primary source of information. They're my primary source of perspective. I think, and I think a lot of this is based on who's in government and who's in power. I think we should start advocating for local decriminalization before we advocate for federal. I don't think we're going to get federal. I don't think that that's the time right now. But it's been really difficult. I mean, they tried so hard to do this in DC, in New York, in Chicago, and they had these public hearings there that were totally divided between those that were abolitionists of sex work, so those that wanted to see sex work completely gone, and those that were pro-sex worker rights, pro-sex work, that they may not agree with sex work, but they don't want it to be taken out as a valid occupation, as something that people can turn to, because they say that sex work is work. It's a legitimate form of labor. But that's going to require a big cultural shift that we're not, like Americans are not, we're not at that cultural shift of recognizing sex work as work. But it's something that we're trying to promote.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Alberto, for sharing your research and thoughts on the topic of intersectional stigma. Great job. Well, what we'll do now is open up the conversation to all the panelists, and I believe that that Skyler had to leave early, which we knew about ahead of time. So it's just going to be it'll be Alberto, Jasmine, and I will share some more of the questions that have come in. And to the audience, at this point, feel free to keep sending questions by chat, or if you want to raise your hand and share the question audibly, we can do that too. That would be great. So I guess the first question to all of you, it's a question from the audience. A lot of the proposed solutions, interventions for intersectional stigma, as the speaker said, naturally will have to be multi-level, including policy level changes that address really difficult and complicated issues like stereotypes, systemic racism, more interpersonal forms of racism. For those of us focused on basic individual level research, what are the gaps in the literature you've seen which basic research can contribute to? And as noted, since the changes need to be made at the systemic level, are there questions that remain at the individual level?
That's a good question. I think that there's definitely still a paucity of research. If folks are just operating at the individual level on experiences, even though we say like that's a sort of flattening of intersectionality in this context, I think if you're not going to add in the multiple levels via assessment, even inquiring about individuals' experiences with accessing care at, for example, an institutional level, or their interactions with providers, like you may not make it multi-level in terms of the individuals that are a part of the study or even by evaluating systems. But if you're interviewing or working with or collecting quantitative data with individuals, I think inquiring about the other levels could be an addition to the research. And I think there, because intersectionality is so comprehensive, there are so many ways that even my work that has utilized intersectionality, I research primarily Black women, but as Alberto was mentioning with sex workers, they are not a homogenous group. Like we have Black women from areas of the Caribbean and Black women from Africa, Black women from here, from the United States, that live in different parts of this country, that have different religions. So even attending to within group diversity, I think is an incredible way to also incorporate some of these elements of intersectionality as well at the individual level.
So I think there's, like, in terms of, I mean, I deliberately chose for my dissertation, I'm looking at male sex work, because there's just not, most of the research focused on sex work is on females, both trans and cisgender. So I wanted to look at male sex workers because that was just such an underrepresented population. But in looking at like stigma and, I mean, there's not a lot, but most of what I found on stigma is on stigma management in stigma coping. And I'm just so much more concerned with resistance. How do people actually resist certain forms of stigma and create, because all these stigmas are derived from these narratives, these false narratives, these stock narratives that are based on racism, sexism, all these different forms of oppression. And so what are those stories for liberation? What are those collective stories for liberation? And that's what I think more the literature needs to focus on. Like, how do these communities, these marginalized communities, actually create new stories, new narratives to resist stigma? I don't think there's enough literature on that.
From both of your approaches, how do you think that that type of resistance or empowerment or pride gets instilled, like, formally through interventions, or do you think it always emerges from the community themselves, and there might not be a place for, kind of outside outside people from outside the community to try to create what may be natural resistance or empowerment or pride?
I think interventions that attend to, beyond like addressing biological factors or things like that, but interventions that attend to making people feel valued and supported. I think that's where we see the positive impacts happening within communities, where individuals, affiliate themselves with individuals who look like them or are experiencing similar things to them. I think it's this notion of feeling valued and supported by a group of others. And so, to the extent that an intervention can do that at the institutional level, or create that within a group, sometimes even if you just put people together in a group who share similar experiences, it happens organically. So that would be the short and sweet version for me, just the working to facilitate folks feeling valued and supported.
So as a social worker, I operate more from what's called a strengths-based framework, which looks at the strengths rather than the deficits. And I love using an empowerment approach to really helping clients and communities create those new narratives, create those new stories, be able to share their story, because there's just so much power in a story and what you can communicate, and how you can use that story to actively change systems, not just change behaviors, but change systems. And I think when it comes to where this has to come from, I think this definitely needs to come from the community within their own strengths. You can use an asset-based approach, for instance, but I think it definitely needs to come from the community. But I think there's certain things that you can do as a researcher to build on those strengths. I mean, I love community-based participatory research. I think that's the prime method, it's a prime vehicle for being able to be co-researchers with that community, to be able to work directly with that community at creating their own intervention or their own, what do they view as transformative change. I also think Dr. Abrams could probably talk more about this, but I also think in like a lot of qualitative research, you can do like photo voice. I love photo voice. Yeah. And I think photo voice, when you're having your participants take pictures and to work through that picture with them, to ask them why they took that picture, and have them co-construct meaning with you. I think there's a really empowering process at work there. So as someone, I consider myself a scholar activist. So in a lot of the research that I do, it's more for building equity and for changing systems and changing policies. So I think that we need to engage in more methodologies and more vehicles that actually build on that, and that really, I think Dr. Abrams, Dr. Jackson were saying this earlier, that really engage the participant or the community that you're working with directly, rather than have them, they're just studied upon, you do your research and then you leave. You need sustainability, and that's how you build trust.
Great. Well, thank you both. You've given us so many great ideas and kind of orientations and mindsets for how to approach community researcher partnerships that I think we might continue drawing upon your expertise and wisdom in the months and years to come as we think about making sure to center that approach to equitable partnerships across all of our work that we're doing. So thank you for sharing those perspectives and overall your full presentations on intersectionality and kind of the nuts and bolts, the theoretical parts, and ultimately the application of it. I'm going to, we have 5 minutes left, and I think there's some final wrap-up kind of housekeeping items. Importantly, we want this to be an ongoing conversation or dialogue. And one possibility is that we continue with the series devoted to intersectional stigma. So any ideas that the audience has for what that might look like and what they might want to see build upon the groundwork that Skyler, Jasmine, Alberto laid today would be excellent. And there's an evaluation survey that Daniel can tell you more about. Before I pass it over to Daniel and others, I just wanted to thank the CIRA team who put this presentation, this series together. Sharon, Daniel, Katie, Pete, Deanie. So thank you very much for all of your work to make this possible, and obviously to our three presenters as well. So Daniel, did you or Deanie want to talk about some of the closeout things with the survey?
Yeah, the survey's in the chat. I imagine we'll send it to everyone who attended by email as well if you got a chat. Deanie, do you want to pull this up? Do you want to say anything about the December 7th event?
Sure, thank you, Danielle. So CIRA is convening a Spatial Wallets Day virtual symposium, as you can see on the screen, and I'm going to share the link to registration and also the program. And everybody is invited, and please share as well with your colleagues and networks if you are interested in attending. And thank you.
Great. And is there anything else?
No, thanks to Pete, who's been manning all the technology to make this work. And there's the registration link for December 7th. I think that's good for today. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. And thank you to the presenters and to the audience for the excellent questions. Enjoy the rest of your week. Take care.